The cedar lid slammed shut with a dull thud, sending a puff of century-old dust swirling into the still air. Thomas Rennard froze, his gloved hand hovering above the wooden box as though it might whisper back. He had been working alone in the Charleston Historical Bureau's basement for hours, cataloging forgotten studio portraits, cracked glass, fading smiles, brittle smiles of families long gone. But this box was different. The faint stenciling across its top read H. W. Daguerre Studio, number 14 East Battery. A note, pinned to the lid in faded blue ink, warned simply, "Handle carefully." Plate unstable. He eased it open again. Inside lay a daguerreotype wrapped in linen and cedar oil paper. Even through his gloves, Thomas could feel the cold of the metal plate. When he peeled the fabric away, the faces appeared. A white merchant seated stiffly, his wife turned slightly toward him, and behind them, half in shadow, a black man in formal livery, expression unreadable. The studio's light had caught on the brass buttons of his coat, the sheen of his hair, the faint shine of something at his wrist. Thomas leaned closer. "What are you holding?" he murmured, adjusting the lamp. The answer came as a glint, a perfect circle of light beneath the man's cuff. It was too even, too deliberate to be an artifact of exposure. He adjusted the magnifier and saw it clearly now. A round dial, ridged at the edge, reflecting the light from his desk. His breath caught. The dial's clarity broke the illusion of age. It looked alive, polished yesterday. He pulled the plate under the scanner, heart pounding as the image bled onto the monitor in shades of silver and gray. The reflection sharpened under spectral adjustment. "No," he whispered. The outline had symmetry, a design impossible for 1869. Tiny numerals curved around the rim, and in the center a faint shimmer of glass. It looked like a wristwatch, one far too modern for the century it supposedly belonged to. Thomas straightened, the chair scraping loudly across the concrete floor. He opened the old catalog record beside him. Family portrait, client, C.W. Branner. No mention of the servant, nothing about an object. His pulse quickened. He flipped through notes by the original curator, chemical analysis, plate oxidation, silver nitrate tests, all ordinary. No one had seen what he was seeing now. The fluorescent lights hummed above. He adjusted the focus again. The light didn't behave right. It seemed to reflect from the object, not onto it. He killed the overheads, letting the single monitor glow fill the room. The faint outline still shone back at him, like the dial emitted its own subtle gleam. "That's impossible," he said, voice breaking the silence. He reached for the intercom but stopped. How could he explain it? A 19th-century man wearing something that wouldn't exist for another 50 years. He tried logic. Maybe the plate's contaminated. Some reflection. His words died as the scan completed. The digital overlay showed distinct material readings. Nickel, silica, trace quartz, not brass, not silver, and the pattern across the dial, 12 equal divisions with one bold mark at the top, 11 o'clock. Thomas frowned. He zoomed in again. The man's eyes, though faint from age, seemed directed toward the object as if watching it. He pushed his chair back, unsettled. Every instinct said to stop, to log the file and move on. But curiosity had already taken root. He retrieved the cedar slip that came with the plate, a studio note from 1869. It mentioned exposure settings, client posture, time of capture, 2:40 p.m., mild overcast. He compared the lighting in the image. The shadows didn't match. The merchant's right side was illuminated, but the glint on the dial reflected light from the opposite direction. The servant's wrist caught sunlight that should not have existed inside that studio. Thomas sat there a long time, watching the frozen image of 3 people trapped in a frame of silver. He felt the peculiar sense that the man in the background wasn't posing. He was waiting for something beyond the photographer's lens. The expression, calm but knowing, seemed to pierce across the years. He stood, pacing the dim aisle of shelves. The air smelled of old varnish and paper. From somewhere above, the radiator hissed. He thought of every explanation: chemical residue, double exposure, reflection from jewelry. None fit. He returned to the monitor again and stared at the cuff, at that small, round impossibility. His mind whispered the simplest, most irrational conclusion: that it was real. He imagined the man's hand tightening around it as the shutter opened, light freezing that impossible moment onto the plate. Maybe the merchant never noticed. Maybe the photographer did and said nothing. Or maybe they all knew, and the photo was meant to hide a secret no one else would understand for 100 years. Thomas shut the scanner and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He should call someone, a supervisor, a historian, anyone. Yet the thought of sharing it filled him with unease. There was something personal in that silent stare, as if the man behind the couple wanted him, and only him, to see it. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor. The power flickered once. When the light steadied, the monitor displayed a brief flare. The reflection on the dial brightened for just a fraction of a second, like a pulse. Thomas stepped back, breath sharp in his throat. Then it faded. The system logs showed no anomaly. He reached for the box to reseal the plate, but paused. Beneath the linen, the surface seemed to glimmer faintly, even in the dark. He covered it anyway, pressing the cedar lid until it clicked shut. He stared at it, feeling the weight of the years pressing between the wood and his hand. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed 11 times. Thomas whispered to no one, "What are you?" His voice echoed through the archival hall, unanswered. He sat down, staring at the closed box, the words from the catalog record still haunting him. Include property attendant as per instruction. A glint of light appeared beneath the lid, brief like a breath through keyhole metal, and vanished again. He reached for his notebook and wrote a single line before closing it. Object reflected light from impossible angle. Then, at the bottom, he added, almost as a warning to himself, the device should not exist in that year or in that man's hand. He turned off the lamp and whispered the words again, as if repeating them would steady his pulse. What you're about to hear unsettled even those who believed history was already written. The year was 1869, and inside the narrow brick studio on East Battery, the air smelled faintly of varnish and smoke. Sunlight pressed through the gauzy curtains, tracing thin lines across the polished floorboards. Henry Whitlock, a quiet man in his early 40s with thinning hair and spectacles fogged by the heat, leaned over his camera box, adjusting the brass fittings with deliberate care. Behind him, the slow tick of the studio clock filled the silence between breaths. The Branner family had arrived precisely at noon, as scheduled. Charles Whitmore Branner, merchant, landowner, and self-proclaimed benefactor of the post-war South, stood tall in a pale linen suit. His wife, Clara, moved with rehearsed grace, her lace gloves folded neatly in her lap as she took her seat beside the velvet chair. Neither spoke much, their eyes darting toward the tall black man standing quietly near the window. "Position him there," Branner instructed, motioning toward the darker corner of the frame. "He's to remain still, no expression." The man obeyed, stepping into shadow. His name was not recorded in Whitlock's ledger, but the way he stood, shoulders drawn back, chin slightly raised, suggested a man who understood stillness not as servitude, but as control. He held his right hand close to his side, as though concealing something within his cuff. Whitlock cleared his throat softly. "If I may, sir, the hand. It catches more light than the rest. Might I adjust the sleeve?" Branner frowned. "No, leave it as it is." His tone carried the certainty of ownership, the kind that discouraged questions. Whitlock hesitated, but nodded. He turned the focusing plate and leaned into the hood of the camera, the inverted image of the trio flickering in the dim glass. The merchant's wife adjusted her shawl. The servant did not move. For a moment, Whitlock thought he saw something glimmer near the man's wrist, a reflection where no light should have reached. He blinked, thinking it a trick of the lens. When he looked again, the glint was gone. He counted under his breath. "Hold steady. 3, 2. The flash ignited. A burst of white magnesium smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes and scattering dust motes through the fading afternoon light. The portrait was captured. When the Branners left, their carriage wheels crunching over the cobblestones, Whitlock lingered in the quiet studio. He removed the glass plate and set it gently in the developing tray. The chemicals hissed faintly. As the image began to emerge, gray outlines, then faces, his pulse quickened. The servant's hand was brighter than before, almost unnaturally defined. A small circle shimmered under the emulsion, reflecting light even in the dim room. Whitlock leaned closer, squinting through his spectacles. "Impossible," he whispered. He reached to adjust the tray, but the reflection seemed to move, not across the surface, but within it, like the gleam of something metallic beneath the skin of the image itself. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor, low and distant. He covered the tray and exhaled slowly. A trick of exposure, he told himself. Yet, when he logged the entry in his ledger, his handwriting faltered. Under the client's name, he hesitated before adding, "Include property attendant as per instruction." The words felt heavy, as though each letter resisted being written. That night, long after the studio lights dimmed, Whitlock returned to the developing room with a candle. He wanted to see the photograph once more before sealing it. The faces stared back at him from the plate, Branner's firm, his wife's cold, and the servant's unreadable. The reflection at his wrist was faint now, but present. He thought of scraping the surface to see if a flaw in the coating caused it, yet something stopped him, an instinct older than reason. By morning, he packed the finished portrait into a cedar box lined with muslin and labeled it Number 14, Branner Family. It was meant to be one of dozens that month, unremarkable among wedding scenes and mourning portraits. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. Before sealing the lid, he scribbled a final note in the margin of his ledger. Object in hand. Reflect the ink bled slightly on the damp paper. Years later, when the ledger resurfaced in an attic trunk in 1912, the handwriting had faded, but that single line drew more attention than the dozens of entries surrounding it. Scholars argued over its meaning. Was it a technical reminder, a correction, or a sign of Whitlock's superstition? The original photograph, still resting in its cedar box, had darkened with time, but the strange reflection remained untouched by decay. Early restorers insisted the shine came from Polish residue or chemical corrosion, yet each chemical test returned consistent exposure, deliberate, not accidental. The glint behaved as if it had been part of the scene all along. By 1920, when the Branner estate prepared to donate its possessions to the local museum, the portrait was already whispered about among collectors. They said the man's eyes appeared sharper each time the image was copied, as though watching whoever dared to study him too long. The archivist handling the transfer, a young assistant named Samuel Hark, noted privately, "The reflection is constant, even under dim flame." He sealed the box again, uneasy, muttering, "Some light should not be remembered." And so the photograph passed quietly from one archive to another, mislabeled, misdated, never fully understood. The note about the object in hand remained the only written clue, its meaning eroded by decades of silence. But within that silence, one truth had begun to form, faint yet insistent, like the echo of a shutter snapping closed in an empty room. The image had captured more than a moment. It had preserved an anomaly. Already, the official explanations began to collapse under their own dust. Beatrice Honeycutt's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the brass clamps of the optical comparator. The smell of varnish and old paper filled the Charleston Museum's restoration room, its narrow windows half covered by faded curtains that filtered the late afternoon light into amber ribbons. The daguerreotype rested beneath the lens, a small, silvery rectangle with a face that refused to stay still. Each time she leaned close, the faint glint beneath the black man's cuff seemed to shift, like a bead of mercury sliding just out of reach. She exhaled carefully and began dictating notes into her phonograph tube. Subject: Branner family portrait, acquired March 1926, condition moderate, emulsion intact. Her voice faltered. Anomalous reflection detected on secondary figure, right-hand wrist. She stopped the recording. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. The hour hand pointed to 11. Beatrice adjusted the mirror angle, narrowing the light beam. "Let's see what you're hiding," she murmured. The comparator's lenses focused and the image expanded, grain giving way to clarity. The man's hand came into sharp view, the tendons taut, fingers frozen around something circular and metallic. 12 faint ridges traced the object's perimeter, like numbers without digits. She blinked. Her breath left a patch of fog on the viewing glass. When it cleared, she saw the reflection again, not where it should be. The light came from the wrong side. Beatrice turned toward the window. The west-facing pane glowed faintly, though the afternoon sun had already dipped behind the warehouses along Broad Street. There was no possible reflection from that angle. She pressed closer to the comparator, peering through the lens again. Now, the metallic dial caught her own reflection, her right eye staring back, distorted across time. The door creaked open. "Working late again, Miss Honeycutt?" The voice belonged to Edwin Marsh, the junior custodian, a lanky man with ink stains on his cuffs. "Just finishing the Branner inventory," she replied, forcing calm into her tone. "This one's peculiar." He approached the table, wiping his hands on a rag. "That the one with the servant?" The estate ledger didn't list his name. Beatrice nodded, eyes still on the lens. "The hand's wrong. The light's wrong. Everything about this plate feels staged or unfinished." Marsh leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the tiny image. "Looks like he's holding something. Can't be a watch, can it?" "Not that early. That's what puzzles me," she whispered. "The exposure pattern suggests something polished, nickel perhaps. But nickel doesn't belong here. Not in 1869 Charleston." Marsh chuckled nervously. Maybe Whitlock liked his props shiny. Beatrice didn't smile. "No, the light source was from the left window, 2:40 in the afternoon, but the reflection comes from the right, an unlit corner." Marsh frowned. "You measured that?" "Twice," she said, "and if you look closely, the dial aligns perfectly with 11. He shrugged. "Maybe that's coincidence." She adjusted the focus again. The man's eyes, faint and distant, seemed fixed on the dial as though waiting for it to change. "No," she murmured. "He's looking at it. He knows it's—" Her voice trailed off as the phonograph needle jammed, leaving a long carbon smear across the page of her typewritten transcript. Marsh stepped back. "You all right, Miss Honeycutt?" Beatrice's gaze didn't leave the lens. The glint had grown brighter, spreading faint illumination across the man's fingers. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw the dial move, the faintest shift of the ridge toward the next mark. Then, as if reacting to her realization, the reflection vanished. She switched off the lamp. The room dimmed, the air heavy with dust. "Seal the plate when I'm done," she said quietly. "No one handles it again without my note." Marsh hesitated. "You think it's cursed or something?" She turned to face him, the lamplight tracing the sharpness of her cheekbones. "Not cursed," she said. "Observed." "Observed by who?" "That's what I mean to find out." That night, Beatrice stayed after closing hours recording her final notes. The museum was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the comparator. She wrote, "The subject's posture suggests tension, right hand closed around an instrument. Dial shows 12 divisions, hour fixed to 11. Possible symbolic significance." Her pen faltered as a faint tapping reached her from the viewing table. Once. Twice. A slow, hollow rhythm, like a heartbeat made of glass. Her pulse quickened. She glanced toward the plate. The glint pulsed again, steady, deliberate, almost expectant. She reached for the clamp to remove it, but the air turned cold, her fingertips numbing. Beneath the lens, the man's expression seemed altered. The shadow around his eyes deepened, and for an instant, Beatrice thought she saw the corners of his mouth lift. Not a smile, but awareness. She stepped back, knocking over the ink bottle. It spilled across the table, black rivulets crawling toward the photograph. Instinctively, she pulled the plate away. A droplet of ink struck her wrist, cold as ice. She gasped. The light flickered and the comparator bulb burst with a pop. Darkness fell, broken only by the faint shimmer from the plate itself. When the janitor found her moments later, she was sitting rigid in her chair, staring at the image in silence. The note beside her typewriter ended abruptly. The carbon ribbon jammed halfway through a sentence. He is looking at it. He knows it is. The last word was nothing but a thick, dried smear. Beatrice resigned from her post that month, citing nervous strain and irregular visual phenomena. The daguerreotype was resealed in its cedar case, labeled for restricted access. In the dim light of the storage vault, the plate's reflection seemed to breathe with a faint metallic shimmer, as though waiting for the right observer to finish her sentence. The plate was sealed, but the question of who or what he was waiting for remained. The spectroreflectometer clicked once, twice, then gave a low hum that filled the dim laboratory. Professor Alan Pritchard leaned closer, his face bathed in the blue glow of the measurement console. "That can't be right," he murmured, adjusting the aperture. The needle steadied between 430 and 460 nanometers, the signature of refined metal, not organic decay. Across the table, the daguerreotype lay beneath a protective glass dome, its silver surface alive with faint reflections from the tungsten lamps. The black figure in the image seemed to stare through time, his wrist catching the light exactly as it had in every photograph since its discovery. Dr. Eleanor Massing stood a few feet away, her posture tense and formal beneath her gray overcoat. She had been summoned from the Royal Chronometric Society after the first tests suggested something impossible. "If that reading holds," she said softly, "you've just found something older than timepieces themselves." Her voice carried a trace of disbelief, but also a flicker of fascination. Pritchard straightened, rubbing his temples. "The device isn't brass, steel, or tin. It's something else, nickel alloy perhaps, but too pure. You can feel it through the plate, almost humming." The assistant, a nervous young man named Harlow, stepped forward with a clipboard. "Sir, should I log it as a foreign inclusion?" Pritchard shook his head. "No, log it as deliberate. Someone placed it there." He paused, eyes narrowing on the plate. "Or someone wanted us to think they did." Outside, the wind clawed against the frosted windows of the Cambridge Institute of Optics. The year was 1938, and the nation hummed with the unease of approaching war. Within those stone walls, however, it was not politics that troubled them. It was the quiet, ticking illusion of time itself. 3 hours later, as they prepared to file the initial results, a telegram arrived from Charleston. It was from Miles Varden, curator of the Museum of Southern Photography. His message was brief and typed in all caps. "Withdraw exhibit. Public not to see until verified." The paper smelled faintly of ozone, as if the telegraph wire itself had overheated delivering it. Pritchard read it twice, then folded it neatly. "They're scared," he said. "Of what?" asked Massing, turning to face him. He hesitated before answering. "Of what it means, if this is real." They sealed the daguerreotype back into its velvet-lined case, stamped with the museum's insignia, and placed it in the Institute's archival vault. Yet that night, Pritchard returned alone. The corridor was empty, lights flickering with the uneven current of the old generator. Inside the vault, He lifted the case again, unable to resist one more look. The image seemed altered. The reflection from the man's wrist was brighter, too bright. Pritchard leaned closer until his own face reflected beside it. For an instant, it looked as though the two reflections shared the same blink, his and the man's synchronized. He stumbled back, nearly knocking over the lamp. He told no one the next morning. Instead, he wrote in his private journal, "Light behaves as if aware." Days later, the daguerreotype was quietly shipped back to Charleston. The Institute's official report was vague, filled with technical jargon that explained nothing. Yet copies of Pritchard's wavelength data circulated privately among scholars, drawing the attention of government archivists and collectors. By spring of 1939, rumors reached Washington, whispers of a photograph containing non-contemporary metallic signatures. Then came the disappearance. When archivist Thomas Leith attempted to locate the telegraph from Varden for verification, it was missing. The Museum of Southern Photography denied ever sending it. No carbon copy, no ledger record, no acknowledgement of receipt. It was as if the message had been sent from a place that no longer existed. Pritchard was summoned to testify before a closed review board. "Do you claim this photograph shows an object beyond its time?" one officer asked, his tone clipped, almost military. Pritchard answered carefully, "I claim only that the material composition cannot be replicated with the methods available in 1869. The board ordered the image withheld pending ethical review. Pritchard signed the document and left without a word. 2 months later, he resigned his post. For years, silence surrounded the daguerreotype. Then, in 1952, a junior registrar cataloging the museum's old inventory discovered the case again. Its file card, portrait number 2137, was newly stamped. Withheld for ethical reasons. No one could explain who had authorized it. By then, stories had spread among staff that the government had reclaimed the image during an inventory of stolen war artifacts. Others whispered about Fort Lawrence Laboratory, said to specialize in temporal corrosion analysis. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, the name appeared in 3 separate requisition slips, all unsigned, all later removed from the archive. A night guard at the museum swore that the storage wing sometimes rattled after midnight, as though machinery deep underground had awakened. When questioned, the director dismissed it as heating pipes expanding. Yet even he refused to enter the vault alone. The last known account came from a letter written by Pritchard himself in 1953, found among his estate papers. He wrote, "They think it measures time. I think it measures us." His words were never published. The museum sealed the portrait permanently, transferring custody to an undisclosed facility. All that remained were scattered records, fragments of reports, and the faint memory of light that had once behaved as though it knew it was being watched. Each document added clarity and another layer of darkness. The laboratory lights flickered once before steadying, throwing pale reflections across the metallic slab where the photograph lay sealed beneath glass. Dr. Roland Eves stood over it, hands braced on the table, the hum of the spectrometer thrumming through his chest like a slow second heartbeat. "Again," he murmured, voice low, more to himself than to the assistant beside him. The younger man adjusted a dial. The machine emitted a sharp click, then a ripple of green light swept across the image. The curve of the tiny device in the black man's hand flashed, catching the beam as though responding. Eves straightened, pushing his spectacles higher. "No brass signature," he said, reading the data spool sliding out from the printer. "Nickel and quartz." His assistant frowned. "But that's impossible. Those alloys weren't refined like this until decades later," Eves finished, his tone clipped. The two men exchanged a long look. The air smelled faintly of ozone and old varnish. At first, the rationalists had been confident. Double exposure, they said, some scrap of studio brass that had caught the light twice. Eves had believed it too, until the readings kept contradicting every logical baseline. He turned to the chalkboard behind him, where faint lines marked emission frequencies, 197 hertz. Every test produced the same pulse, recurring like the beat of a living heart. He spoke softly, as though reluctant to give the thought weight. It repeats every 11 seconds. His assistant tried to joke. Maybe the camera caught the man's pulse. Eves looked at him sharply. The camera was static. Exposure lasted 45 seconds. No motion blur, no reflection shift. And yet, this pulse persists. The museum committee summoned him 2 weeks later. The boardroom smelled of dust and formality. Miles Varden, the curator, tapped the telegram on the table. "Withdraw exhibit, public not to see until verified." Those were my words. Now you tell me we have a piece of machinery inside a daguerreotype. Eves's fingers trembled slightly as he spread the spectrographs. It's not machinery, not entirely. The composition suggests an integrated lattice. Something between metal and, he hesitated, eyes catching the photograph again. Organism laughter rippled around the table, brief and nervous. "You mean to tell us," Varden said, "that this man was holding a living watch?" Eves didn't answer. He only pointed to the printout. The pulse doesn't come from reflection. It comes from emission. By night, he replayed the readings alone. Each oscillation built upon the last, a low resonance crawling through the lab floor. He began to imagine it syncing with his own heartbeat. 11 seconds apart. Always 11. In the reflection of the glass, the man's eyes seemed less vacant, focused, patient. Letters arrived from colleagues across the Atlantic. Some accused him of fraud, others begged for proof. Dr. Eves wrote a final note in the margin of his report. Chronometer mismatch, emission pattern, 197 hertz repeating every 11 seconds. He sealed it, unaware that the museum would soon mark the photo withheld for ethical reasons. Years later, those who revisited his data found discrepancies in his pulse logs, as if the pattern had altered while he observed it. The rational theory crumbled. The procedural theory took its place. Perhaps Branner, the merchant, had staged the scene to conceal smuggled Union technology. But when the Branner estate was audited, no such devices existed. Only plows, tobacco presses, and ledgers filled with debts. So the whispers began again. Late-night speculation in university halls. They said the servant in the photograph had not been a man at all, but something inhabiting the shape of one, sent to mark time differently. Some claimed the device was not worn but welded, a bond between flesh and metal. The dial, they insisted, didn't count hours, it counted openings. One archivist who studied the plate claimed to see the dial's shadow advance though the man's fingers never moved. Another swore the air grew colder each time he looked too long. No two accounts agreed, yet all shared the same refrain. The photo watched back. Eves's instruments, locked in their crates, continued to tick faintly when no current ran through them. Students described hearing a rhythmic hum between walls, 11 seconds apart. By the time official reports were filed, the museum could no longer maintain a coherent explanation. The brass theory had failed, the smuggling story dissolved, and the whispers outgrew the evidence. Only the photograph remained, its metallic glint untouched by time, its reflection impossible to reproduce. Standing in that sterile lab, Eves had once whispered to no one, "The science of time has met something older than itself." At exactly 3:17 a.m., the silence in the Charleston Historical Bureau shattered with a faint click, not loud but sharp, deliberate, like the snap of a clock hand finding its mark. Isaac Halberd, night technician, froze mid-sip of stale coffee. He turned slowly toward the sealed case across the room. The portrait hadn't moved, of course it hadn't, but something in the air had. It felt thinner, colder. He set the mug down, rose without a sound, and stepped toward the temperature control panel, blinking at the sudden drop. 10 full degrees, though the vents had not activated. His boots tapped softly against the stone floor as he approached the glass case holding portrait number 2137. Then he saw it. Condensation bloomed in slow spirals across the interior glass, not from outside humidity, which was impossible in a climate-controlled archive, but from within. He stepped closer. His breath caught. The photograph, long dormant in its silver frame, now shimmered faintly. The man in the background, the unnamed figure who for decades had stood still and quiet, appeared different. His eyes, they were no longer fully closed. The lids, once relaxed in permanent slumber, had parted just enough to expose the faintest glint of light where pupils should never be. And then the glow. The metallic object beneath his cuff pulsed once, then again, then again. 7 pulses in total, slow and steady, each sending a soft, unnatural sheen across the daguerreotype's mirrored surface. Halbert stumbled back. "What the hell?" he muttered, but there was no one to answer. The ticking had started, soft and rhythmic, not from the room, but from inside the sealed case. He bolted. By morning, the case had returned to stillness. No fog, no pulse. The air was its normal cool again. But something had changed. When the negative print was developed from the backup scanning plate that morning, the archivists fell silent. A new marking had appeared, undeniable, deliberate. A thin, darkened line now extended from the figure's wrist to the chest of the seated merchant. Not a crack, not damage, a perfect line, straight, smooth, as though drawn with intent. The head archivist, William Reese, ordered the wing closed. The official note cited chemical leakage and fogging inconsistencies. Unofficially, no one wanted to be near the plate after dark. Years passed. The case was quietly marked restricted. But in 2006, curiosity resurfaced in the form of digital archivist Marin Coyle. A reserved man in his early 40s, Coyle had heard whispers during graduate research about File 1869B, how the sealed print was said to breathe in the dark. He dismissed it as exaggeration, folklore warped by academic boredom. Still, something drew him in. The drawer was unlocked with 2 keys. Coyle wore gloves, triple-checked the climate lock, and fed the plate into a high-resolution scanner. What emerged made him go still. The dial beneath the figure's sleeve, once smeared and barely legible, now scanned with crystal clarity. Its markings, 12 divisions, ridged outer ring, a recessed crown, matched exactly with the 1959 design of the Brelmont Aerotimer Series 4. A watch design not patented until 90 years after the photograph was taken. Coyle leaned back in his chair, heartbeat climbing. "That's not possible," he whispered. His eyes darted from the screen to the plate, and then again he heard it. A faint, steady ticking. Not from the scanner, not from his own wrist. From behind the archive wall. They searched for wiring, plumbing, anything mechanical. But the wall was solid. No cavities, no vents, no devices. Still the ticking came. Intermittent, at irregular intervals. Always at night. Today, the portrait sits in a temperature-controlled drawer at the Oster Museum. No public display, no tour signs. Only a plaque that reads Catalog Number 2137. Access restricted. But for those who've stood near the drawer, especially on quiet nights, there's one thing they all report. The ticking never stops. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of hidden history, oppression, and the power of overlooked details to reveal deeper truths. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire reflection on justice and humanity, and remind us how every story, especially those silenced, deserves to be seen and remembered.